Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how to program the FMS on the Boeing 747 in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is when you do go to do this, the simplest way in the universe to do all of it is to actually have Flight Simulator preload the flight plan in you using the flight plan loader. Or if you prefer, use a different program and then load the flight plan in like that. Both those methods work absolutely great. Again, the disadvantage is you're not going to get the full experience, so to speak, but the advantage is in the real world, believe it or not, most of the stuff you get in the FMS, you'd actually have gotten using basically a data link that you get from your company. So let's go ahead and get this thing started, shall we? First things first, I'm going to go ahead and flip on my battery as well as my external power. When you have an aircraft this size, it's not unusual to have two separate ground power units. In this case, we're just going to go flip it on. I'm not going to do the APU or anything like that. I'll do all that starting business a little bit later on. But again, the focus of all this is basically on making sure the flight management system works properly. So let's go ahead and program this sucker. So here is our flight management screen. This is basically going to be everything we need to know and need to use in order to program the computer on board. When we first get on board this aircraft, depending on the situation, again, depending on the company, depending if this is the fancy payware version or the basic Microsoft version, normally the first thing you would do is you come down here and you press the pause init button. We have all these little soft keys on either side, and they basically correspond to the line directly next to it. So in this case, I'm going to come over here and press pause init. So this basically allows you to initialize the position of this aircraft so that when you go ahead and decide to start, you're going to be starting at the same point every time. In the old days, setting this particular step up was very, very difficult to do because you had to know precisely where you were on the ground in order to tell your INS, that's your inertial navigation system, exactly where you were. Of course, since the technology has moved on a little bit, we now have GPS positioning technology, which gives us the ability to know exactly where we are. In the old days, basically what you do is you come in here, you go ahead and dial in where you started, and you put it in the reference airport. What that would do then is you would go ahead and look into a library and tell you what your current latitude and longitude position are. Then what you would do is you come over here and you dial in what gate you're in. And that would give you a very, very precise estimate as to where you're physically located. Then you'd use that to go ahead and start up our INS system. Now, in this or fancy version, our INS thing would be started by pressing these switches up above our heads. But we don't have to worry about that today, and that's actually not a bad thing. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go to this GPS POS, and we're going to click on the soft key right next to it. What that's going to do is that's going to copy our current position into the scratch pad down here. Now all I have to do is click right where it says Set IRS POS, just like that. So now the aircraft knows exactly where it currently is. This is actually wonderful for us because it simplifies things quite a bit. Now, if we wanted to get fancy, we could actually go to the different pages, and normally it would give you all the information about things like your requested navigational performance rather. It would tell you things about which your IRS says. It'd tell you where the computer thinks you currently are. You would have information, everything you could possibly need. The bad news is none of this works, so it looks pretty cool, but it doesn't do much. The next step on our little journey here is going to be to set up our route. Now, normally when we do this, as soon as we typed in our little position before, you have a little thing down in the scratch pad that would tell you exactly where you currently are like this. So in this case, unfortunately it didn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. Again, this is the ICAO code for our particular airport we're starting at. We're Bradley International today. I'm going to go up and click that into the origin panel up in the top left here. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and dial in my destination. So in this case, we're going to be traveling down to Baltimore Washington International Airport, which is Kilo Bravo Whiskey India. I've been on this flight in the real world enough times that I probably could do it just closing my eyes. So now we have our origin, we have our destination. That's technically all we need to fly this plane. As a matter of fact, if I go ahead and zoom out a little bit here, you can actually see a line has now been projected between those two specific positions. Now, the reason I particularly like this is because that's basically going to get us everything we need to know as far as how to fly a really basic flight. Now, unfortunately, in the real world, you don't really just go direct. Most people, especially those with virtual airlines, will actually take real airline procedures and they'll borrow them for their actual flights. Now, if we wanted to do that, we could, for example, go pop over to a website like SkyVector, and we could actually find somebody's initial flight and go ahead and copy their plan directly into our computer. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and steal this one right here. So let's go ahead and pop down to our FMS and get ready. So to enter a flight plan into the FMS, it's actually pretty easy. I'm going to press on the next page button on the legs, or the route page, I should say. This is going to let me dial in my waypoints. This one on the left is going to be indicating how I get there, such as airways. And this one on the right is going to be direct waypoints. So taking a look at our little note from earlier, I can see that my first waypoint is called VEERS. That is Victor, Echo, Echo, Romeo, Sierra. I'm simply going to go boop, pop that right there like that. Now, don't be surprised if the flight simulator takes a few moments to go ahead and process that. The next one is called BIZEX. It's a BIZEX. BIZEX. Bravo, India, Zulu, Echo, X-ray. Go ahead and dial that in there just like that. Now, sometimes it's going to take a moment, like I said, to process. Now, our next waypoint is a little tricky. I noticed that it begins with the letter Q, which means it's a Quebec airway. Now, airways are entered a little differently here. Instead of putting them on this side, we're going to put them on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and do Q, and again, it's Quebec 75, and put it right here. Now, as soon as I do that, you can see that it appears here, but you need to connect this airway directly to its exit waypoint. In this case, the exit waypoint is going to be a Modena VOR, which is Mike X-ray Echo. I'm just going to put that right there. It's going to take a moment because basically what's happening is Microsoft is going to sit there and go, let me see if I can find that. Oh, there it is. Boop, just like that, we're good to go. So our next one is going to be Victor Tree 78, which again is another airway. I'm going to click it right here. Again, it has to go and find Victor 378. Keep in mind, we run into a situation where if my last waypoint is not plugged into that airway, this whole thing is going to have a heart attack on you. Now, fortunately for us, I noticed that it does not appear. So it's like, uh-oh, what's the problem? Well, let me see what happens if I accidentally type in our final waypoint, which is hilariously named Nuggy. Ha-ha! Do you see how it reappeared? And now we're pretty good to go. Our final waypoint says something about Trish 3. Trish 3 is actually a star, so I'm not going to worry about that just yet. So now our waypoints have been entered. I'm now good to go. I'm going to click on the Activate button and then press Execute. Now, the cool thing here is if I go to legs, you can actually see my individual legs of my flight now. Everything's looking pretty solid. So I actually like this. We're in great shape. So the next thing I like to do is to go ahead and set up my departure and arrivals. Now, the nice thing is if we want to find out where we're departing from, I can always just call up ATIS real quick, and we can ask them real nicely. And what they'll do is they'll go ahead and read it to us. Oh, I switched the wrong they keep flipping me off. It's runway tree today, in case you were curious. So I'm going to go to departure arrival. And I have this button for departure. I'm going to press right here. And now you can pick your SID and you can pick your runway. So the SID is going to be your departure procedure. We had a pretty good video on this a little while ago. We're going to be using the Bradley 4, which is this incredibly boring one. Now, the cool thing is after I pick my SID, I can then pick my active runway. I'll say tree, and then press the execute button right here. Now, if you look at my little map here, you'll notice, look at how slick this is. It actually will tell me exactly where my flight starts, and it'll take me, if I zoom out a little bit, all the way through my individual waypoints. That is so awesome. Okay, so that is now all set. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to start looking at our performance profile. But before I even do that, I'm going to go ahead and set my arrival down at Bradley, or I should say BWI as well. So I'm going to go back to departure arrival. I'm going to click on the R button. So if you remember a minute ago, I mentioned something about Trish 3. That's my Trish 3. That's my arrival procedure. I'm just going to click that right there. And I'm, of course, going to go ahead and select my approach. Notice your approaches are limited based on your star. So in this case, we're going to be using ILS tree right. Go ahead and click that. I'm going to press the execute button. Delightful. Now, if I did something really silly, like zoomed out all the way, you could actually see my entire flight plan all the way down to the ground at BWI. Again, that's one of the amazing things about this technology. So I'm going to go to the legs page. I'm just going to quickly confirm that there's nothing weird going on. By the way, when you're entering a route, if you make a mistake, press the delete key and then click on the thing you made the mistake on. That'll delete it for you. Don't forget to reactivate and re-execute if you do that. Now, let me show you another really cool trick with this particular system. I can actually go up to this switch here and set this to plan mode. And now, if I'm in legs page, I can actually step through each and every one of my waypoints. Now, it's kind of hard to see here, so if you zoom out a little bit, now I can actually go through my entire flight plan step by step by step to confirm everything makes perfect sense. Now, that's just a really cool feature of this particular system. It's one of the reasons I really like it, too. Okay, so my flight plan is loaded. We're good to go. In the real world, normally what we do is we go in here and we go ahead and save this flight plan, but we're not going to worry about that today. My flight number is 64. Go figure. All right, the next thing we need to do is we need to dial in the performance characteristics of this aircraft. Now, this differs from the real aircraft in a bunch of ways, and I'll point that out. So I'm going to come down here and hit perf init. If for some reason you're over here and you're like, how do I get out of here? You can always press init ref and jump back to the main index and go ahead and select the one you want. In this case, I'm going to select perf for performance. Now, normally this information you'd have to enter by hand or have it data linked from your company. Unfortunately for us, as you can see, we've got no communication with our data links, so we're busted. The most important thing here is your cruise altitude. So remember, this is going to be in flight level. So if I want to go to 35,000 feet, I type in tree 50. Go ahead and put that in. The next number that would be very important for us, especially in the real world, would be the cost index, which is the ratio of speed versus fuel consumption. Obviously, in this particular case, we can't set it. Normally, also, we'd come in here, we'd set our cruise center of gravity, we'd set our set step size if we're doing step climbs, but we have no control over that in this version of Flight Simulator, so I'm not going to use it. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Thrust Limit. Now, this is interesting. By default, Flight Simulator starts your maximum thrust at a 10% power reduction. Now, this is interesting because if we were a light aircraft, which we are, a 10% power reduction is actually safer because if we lose engines, it could cause us to pull off the runway. Now, if we were jerks, we could go and click this button right here, which now gives us maximum power for our engines during climb and takeoff. Keep in mind, in certain places, such as where I am now, we have noise abatement, so you wouldn't actually be allowed to use full takeoff thrust because we'd be too loud. The other common method people use to reduce your takeoff thrust instead of doing a D rate is by actually selecting a temperature other than the current temperature. We could actually fool the aircraft into thinking it's 45 degrees outside, and that causes our power to actually change. Now, if I said it was 10 degrees outside, notice, oh, it's out of range, bummer. We'll try 15 degrees. Boop, there we go. Notice we get a different takeoff power than we would otherwise. Now, another slick trick, too, is we have this TOB, which is called bump thrust. We don't have access to it. It would actually overload our engines to give us even more takeoff power. And again, always pick the one that makes most sense for this application. For me, I'm going to pick maximum takeoff power because, I paid for this airplane. I intend to use it. Next, we're going to look at our takeoff page. Now, this is kind of tricky. Now, normally what you do is you come in here and you say what takeoff flaps you want to use. Let's say we want to use 10 degrees of flaps, and you click right here like this. As soon as you do that, it would populate this page with critical speeds that you would need to go ahead and use in order to safely fly the plane. So it doesn't do that in this version. Instead, what you have to do is you have to actually slap the flap lever into the position you want the flaps to be in, and then the speeds will update themselves. In this case, our V2, which is the most important number we need to know, is 159 knots. Now, normally what we would do is we'd take that V2 value, we'd come up here and we'd actually manually dial it in here so that that would be our speed. Remember, the V2 is basically your leaving the ground speed. Normally, by the way, you would never want the auto throttle turned on in situations like this. So that's pretty much all we have to do as far as getting this aircraft set up and ready for flight on the FMS. Unfortunately for us, we don't have this lovely progress page that we would normally have access to that would allow us to be able to estimate our times and things along those lines. So instead, we're kind of stuck doing it the old-fashioned way. Now that the FMS has all been set up, usually what I like to do is I like to come over to my MCP for the autopilot and get that set up. The first thing you're going to want to notice is what your starting altitude is. Now, normally what's going to happen in the real world is you're going to go ahead and call for clearance, and they're going to say climb and maintain this particular speed via this particular situation. Now, when you do that, of course, you'd want to go ahead and set that top altitude right up here in your MCP. Now, if you're incredibly lazy, what you could do is you could set this all the way up to your cruise altitude. Let's say we said 35,000 feet, and literally leave it alone. Next thing, normally what we do is we go ahead and set our heading to be whatever the takeoff heading is going to be. In this case, if you remember, we're going to be using runway tree, which I believe is about tree 27 is going to be roughly what that particular angle is going to be. After that, we're in pretty darn good shape. It's simply a matter of taking the aircraft all the way to the runway and letting it go. We'll take a look at that in a moment. All right, we've been cleared to go ahead and take off, and we're going to go ahead and do that now. Now, the one thing that we do a little differently once we go ahead and get everything kind of set up here is there's a couple different philosophies as far as what the best way to go ahead and get this aircraft going and goes. Now, if you set your FMS up really, really carefully, you can actually do this the ultimate lazy way, as I'd like to kind of call it. And we'll actually demonstrate that technique right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to let the flight management computer basically do everything for us. The only thing we need to do is basically push the button that gets this thing rolling. Now, remember, when you're taxiing this thing, you're pretty significantly high in the ground, so you're always going to have just a little bit of delay. And it also depends on your center of gravity, too. If you got your center of gravity a little bit too high or a little bit too low, it's going to give you all sorts of kind of fun trouble when you're trying to get this thing around. Keep in mind, this is usually an easier turn to make, but this is a pretty tight airport as it is. Now, the trick here is you can't push your foot all the way down when you're trying to get this thing to turn, or it's not going to work on you very well. Okay, let's go ahead and get this thing set up. So we've got our takeoff lights everything's all ready to go. We'll go ahead and flip everybody on. Normally, of course, you want to go ahead and start your timer. Apparently, we have two PTT buttons as opposed to a timer button, but that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press LNAV, and I'm going to click on VNAV. And now all I have to do to literally do this entire flight automatically is come over here, bop the toga button. Go ahead and jump back in my seat here, and let's do it. So remember, just like we did in the flight management computer, we've got this thing set up so that it's speeding up very, very, very quickly. It's going to go to exactly 100% thrust, just like we intended it to do. The only thing we really have to do is lift up the flaps and take care of the gear once we get to that particular moment. All right, we're going down pretty aggressively here. Let's go. Landing gear comes up. I'm going to go ahead and flip on the automatic pilot once we get 200 feet off the ground. About 500 feet. There we go. And we're just going to go ahead and let the aircraft go ahead and cruise out on its own. So you can see not a lot of craziness going on as far as that goes. I basically got everything set up just the way that it needed to be. And now the aircraft is kind of cruising along on its own without too much excitement, as you can kind of see, just like that. And we are on our way. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the rest of the flaps. Looking pretty good.
For frequency change.
All right, let's get going.
Approach red 64 is type Boeing B748.
And that's it. We can basically let this plane fly itself pretty much all the way to the destination. Once we do get to the destination, literally all we'd have to do is go ahead and set the thing up, press the approach autopilot button. The ILS frequencies are going to be preset for us, but we won't have to worry about that for a little while. Again, we'll go ahead and kind of fast forward things and get us ready for our approach. Okay, we're hitting just about the top of our descent at this particular point. You can see I picked up a little bit of ice when we did our initial kind of climb out here. Nothing too concerning. Now, an interesting thing is our flight management system decided that the nuggy altitude was supposed to be 0 feet. By the way, I went over to the legs page. So unfortunately for us, if we wanted to let the VNAV do all the hard work here, not really going to be able to take advantage of that because it's going to try to drive us into the ground. So what's going to happen here is I just want to show you kind of what this does, just so you're aware of it. A little bit of a review as far as things you got to watch out for. I'm going to go set this down to, let's say, about 2,000, say 3,000 feet or so. Now, normally what you would do in this FMS is if it wasn't an actual waypoint that was linked to a specific procedure, as an example, what we could actually do is we could actually come in here and do slash, and then we could type in the altitude we want it to be at. So in this case, let's say I want it to be at 11,000 feet. But you can see that that particular functionality doesn't work in this one. Oh, we don't want to have to touch the speed brake lever just yet. The other thing we could do as well is we could actually come in here, and let's say we want to be at 225. We could do something like this, and we could actually override the speed on that side. Unfortunately, that is not a feature that this particular system has. So in this particular case, we're going to be getting ready to go ahead and descend the aircraft. Once we cross the MXE, I'll go ahead and speed up time a little tiny bit here to kind of get us on our way. Once we cross in Modena VOR, the aircraft is going to automatically start descending. The reason I know this is I've set the floor of my altitude to be 3,000 feet, and I'm also still on VNAV as well as in LNAV mode. Again, this is just a review of some stuff I did with the previous video where we took a look at some of the cool stuff you could do with the mode control panel on this aircraft. Now, the reason I unpaused everything when we got up to this point is because I wanted to show you what it's going to look like when you want to get ready to go ahead and land the aircraft. Notice, by the way, that half of my anti-icing system is on because it's trying to get rid of all that garbage ice that's sent to us right now. I've actually had to go up here and flick everything onto auto just to kind of make things a little bit easier. All right, we're crossing that waypoint right now. So now we're going to be on our way over to Nuggy. I'm just going to confirm visually real quick that everything's moving as quick as it should. Looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and activate a manual descent. We're not really going to be able to take advantage of the automatic descent in this particular case because of the fact that we have that kind of funky waypoint. Now notice, even though our next one is selected for this particular position, it's not going to let us just go boo all the way down like we need to. We need to actually do it manually. So I'm actually going to flip this off. I'm going to go ahead and pull that back. And the aircraft is going to start descending on its own in just a minute. We've got to slow down just a tiny bit before this aircraft's going to start coming down. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at what we need to do in the FMS system to prepare for our approach. So first things first, I'm going to press the init ref button. That's going to bring us back to our index. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on this thing that says the word approach. When you click on the approach, it's going to bring up all the information that we need to know on the approach based on the approach that we selected earlier when we pressed the depth and arrive button. Now keep in mind, at any point I could go in here, go to arrival, and actually change the runway I'm approaching. In this case, I'm perfectly happy with that particular runway, so I'm going to go back to my index. I'm going to go back one more time, go to the approach button, and now we have an important decision to make. We need to decide whether or not we're going to be landing with 25 degrees of flaps or 30 degrees of flaps. Now, normally what you could do is, just like you can see here, I can click on this little nudge, and it's going to bring up this thing here, which allows me to set my reference speed for my landing. Now, if I like that, I could just click right here and lock it in. Now, let's say I want to go ahead and do my usual 5 knots over so that I have a little bit of a safety buffer when I go to land the aircraft. So what I could do instead is I could type in my flaps, do a slash, and then go ahead and type in. So in this case, 157 plus 5 is going to give us 162. And now I can manually override what the reference speed for my landing is going to be. Now, I checked with the METAR. This is actually real world conditions in case you were curious. And I had to actually check it real quick to see what the actual weather was down at BWI. There's actually no wind today at all. So this little 5 knot extra is just going to be exactly what it is, a 5 knot extra. We don't have to worry about putting in half the wind factor or anything along those lines because everything is set to go. Now, what makes this aircraft so different from a lot of other aircraft is the ILS system is built into the FMS as well. As a matter of fact, if I click this button that says nav and rad and open it up real fast, you'll notice that the ILS has already been pre-selected for us. So when we press the approach button to land the aircraft, it will automatically throw that particular frequency directly into our computer. Also note here, we can dial in our left and right VOR frequencies and our left and right ADF frequencies should we choose to go ahead and use them for that purpose. So we're going to continue our descent here. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the legs page. And I'll go ahead and meet you guys when we get a little bit closer to the approach to show you what that's going to look like. Okay, we're nice and on final approach now. You can see the airport way off there in the distance. I'm going to start reducing power now. One of the great things about this is I can actually arm the approach at any time. I can just slap that button. And you'll notice that we've got the correct ILS because I'm noticing that it's approaching up here. Go ahead and throw it down so a couple notches of flaps here. Now remember, a little while ago, we went ahead and set under initial reference. We went to approach, and we actually set everything up here. Keep in mind, if the aircraft got significantly lighter, since when you were getting everything all preset a little bit earlier, you would notice that the speed would have changed as well. So it's kind of important that you consider that when you're getting ready for any of these kinds of flights. So anyway, we've got ourselves on the correct ILS. I'm looking out the runway. I can see it directly off my nose. The great thing now, I'm going to go ahead and put my next notch of flaps down. I am controlling the engines directly. It's just a little bit easier in this particular case. There's definitely a glitch where you cannot change out of Mach mode, which is a little frustrating, but at the same time is, it's the kind of things that actually happen in real airplanes. We're just kind of put up with it, so to speak. Go ahead and bring on my next notch of flaps down. The aircraft's going to start slowing down very aggressively. Remember, we're going to be using a total of 30 degrees of flaps and about 162. Notice my handy dandy 162 knots has been marked with this little ref line right here. We know it's there because of the fact that we set it there a moment ago. Now, what you're probably interested in is why all of a sudden when you put the flaps all the way down, did that ref line decide to move itself all the way down here? Now, that's an interesting question. And normally what would happen is when you set your ref up, that would stay consistent. In this case, it's deciding that our actual reference speed should have been a little bit slower, in this case about 147 knots. That's just something you're going to have to kind of watch out for, and it will make a pretty big difference as far as your landing performance is going to go. So I find that this must be dynamically calculated. I find that this must have been based on your original speeds. I just find that whole thing kind of interesting. Like, if I go back here and go back to approach, this number should be reflected in this number right here. In this case, it is not. So again, that's something you want to kind of watch out for between what our calculated speed was and what its new and improved calculated speed actually is. Again, that's just another quirk we're going to have to kind of keep an eye out for when we do any landings. Now, we're going to let the aircraft go ahead and do an automatic landing on this particular flight here because it's appropriate given we've been using the computer. I have not disengaged the autopilot since 500 feet off the ground when we first started our flight up in Connecticut a little bit earlier. Again, that is the magic of modern autopilot, that you can get away with this much. The only other aircraft really you can get away with this in Airbus. Obviously, you can get away with this in the 787. There's really not a lot of other aircraft that have quite this level of sophistication. I could see the auto throttle is still a little disappointed in me that I disconnected it. Like I said, it doesn't get along with me all the time, so unfortunately, like I said, sometimes I'll just manually override it. If you use the flight plan that came directly out of Flight Simulator, like you tried to import it directly, this would be much, much safer. Like you wouldn't have a lot of these kind of little glitches, but at the same time, like I said, it's kind of worthwhile. By the way, if you're wondering why my screen is turning orange, it's because I turned on terrain mode. You can actually shut that off if it bothers you a little bit. Again, it's always a good idea to zoom in. So just like all instrument approaches, it's highly recommended that you go ahead and determine what your final approach is going to be, so that if you need to do a missed approach procedure, everything can be set up. Again, I'm going to set that correctly. Missed approach is actually going to take us up to 4,000 feet. Just checking my little flight plan real quickly here. Again, I'm having to massage this throttle myself, which is a little difficult. This is why in the real world, of course, you have a co-pilot who can do a lot of the stuff for you, especially when things go wrong. They're wonderful to have around, kind of a thing. All right, again, the only thing I'm controlling right now is the throttle. As you can see, because of the way that this thing is still glitched out a bit, it's still trapped in Mach mode, and I can't do anything. Another interesting thing you'll note is we're still in LNAV mode. That's interesting. My landing gear are down. Go ahead and cycle them one time just to see if I can get that error to go away. No, we're still getting a warning about landing gear. Okay, this is going to become a manual approach. So we have no idea whether or not the landing gear will be able to hold our weight. So hopefully this video has been helpful as far as learning how to program the FMS goes. There's a lot to this aircraft, obviously, and you've got a lot of controls in a lot of different places that you're going to have to make sure that you get perfect almost every single time. This will be a very interesting landing. That's actually a little unexpected. Those random failures every once in a while just have a fun little way of kind of showing themselves. A little bit of a crosswind here today, but nothing too bad. Going to go ahead and reduce the power. Get a couple feet off the ground. I don't think we're going to make it. Going around. All right, folks. Hopefully you found that video sort of interesting. Again, in this particular case, that was kind of an exciting little ending. But again, sometimes these sort of things do happen. Normally, of course, we go all the way around, get everything all kind of pre-set up and on our way. The important thing here is that we did recognize there was a malfunction. We did give the aircraft a good amount of time to go ahead and get everything ready. And of course, we set up our FMS correctly. Enjoy.